Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Jack had dragged Matt into the shadowed corners of his private estate, locking him down behind heavy doors that creaked ominously with every tense step. A storm was brewing, a storm fueled by Jack's cold wave, calculating mind and a hunger for influence over Victor Newman, the man who had always been both his rival and, in some crooked sense, his preoccupation, and now, with Matt pulsing, bruised, and confused in Jack's iron grip, the air thick with the scent of leather, precious whiskey, and fear, the stakes couldn't have been advanced, because Jack wasn't just holding Matt and turned for the sake of atrocity. However, he deduced some of that dark satisfaction from watching Matt's query turn into terror, but rather, he saw an occasion, a chance to strike a deal so covert, so explosive, that it could trip alliances, reveal secrets long buried, and force Victor into a corner he'd no way forgive, and Matt, despite his shock and moping unbelief at being entangled by someone he'd formerly allowed a friend, could not. Notice the careful way Jack had planned everything. He had set up the room with lighting that made long shadows across the floor. The cameras were placed right to catch every little movement, every nervous breath, every sign of fear. Jack would use all of this to his advantage when he talked to Victor. Victor would be very surprised to hear that Matt was alive and in Jack's control. For a time Victor had thought that Matt was safe, that he had escaped all the dangers and fights that had been a part of life at the Newman home. Now that Victor knew the truth, he was thinking about how to save Matt, how to get back at Jack, and what would happen if Jack got what he wanted. This was a deal because if Jack succeeded it would cause a lot of problems for Victor, both personally and professionally. That is why Jack, ever the puppet master, delighted the study of telephoning Victor's number himself, knowing that the pressure in Victor's voice when he realized the counter-accusations of Matt's prisoner would be both succulent and profitable, because Jack didn't simply want to hold Matt, he wanted to control the narrative, to manipulate every player on this stage like pawns in a chess game, with Matt's veritably life as the ultimate stake. And as Jack paced the bottom, his polished shoes echoing in the cavernous room, he outlined his strategy audibly, knowing that indeed Matt, disoriented and alarmed, would fate the genius of Jack's plan, for it wasn't just about plutocrat, influence, or vengeance, it was about power, about demonstrating unequivocally that Jack Abbott could orchestrate chaos and bend the megacity's most redoubtable forces to his will, all while maintaining an air of imperturbable control, and Matt, who had faced peril ahead but infrequently of this magnitude, plotted to grasp the magnitude of what was passing. Because Jack's deal wasn't a simple rescue or a transitory trouble, it was a strictly constructed maze of cerebral warfare, designed to force Victor into a position where every choice carried profound consequences, and the knowledge that Jack had anticipated every possible response, every hopeless move Victor might make, left Matt both alarmed and admiration-struck, knowing that the fate of not just himself, but the delicate balance of power in Genoa City, hung by a thread that Jack gripped tightly in his hands. And as Jack's lips coiled into a subtle, nearly inappreciable boo, he spoke of Victor with an admixture of respect and disdain, describing in pictorial detail how the deal would unfold, how Victor's pride, temper, and strategic brilliance would all be tested, how the megacity's nobility would watch in stupefied seductiveness as Jack, for formerly, held the upper hand in a battle that was decades in the timber, and Matt, hearkening to every calculated word, felt the weight of responsibility press down upon him, realizing that his own survival depended not only on his capability to endure Jack's cerebral games but also on the possibility of negotiating his way out, of ever turning Jack's intricate scheme to his advantage without waking Victor to the full extent of the trap, which, if mishandled, could affect in consequences far worse than physical detriment, because the reports, careers, and veritably lives of those involved were now intricately entangled, and the pressure was palpable, creaking in the air like electricity, as Jack, seeing Matt's internal struggle, leaned in near, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tale that promised peril, occasion, and a disclosure so explosive that it could ever alter the connections, alliances, and battles that had defined Genoa City for generations, and Matt, though alarmed, couldn't help but feel a spark of determination enkindle within him. Because while Jack sought to dominate the situation fully, Matt realized that he'd agency, that subtle choices, clever words, and timing could shift the balance, if only he could maintain clarity under Jack's rough, checking aspect. Victor Newman's world was falling apart outside that room. When he got a message from Jack about Matt being a prisoner, he felt angry and scared. This feeling had helped him through tough times before, like battles over business and family betrayals. Now, with Matt's life in danger, Victor knew he had to act and make smart decisions. If he made one move, it could play right into Jack's hands. The stakes were higher than ever. Meanwhile, in Jack's lair, everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Jack was explaining his plan, thinking about every move Victor could make and how he would respond. Matt was trying to understand the plan, anticipate what would happen, and survive. He realized he was more than a prisoner. He was a key part of a plan that could change everything in Genoa City. As time went on, the pressure kept building. Matt was scared for his life. He was also determined to survive. He knew that to get through this he would need all his courage, cleverness, and ability to adapt. The game Jack had set up was not about winning or losing. It was about manipulating people's feelings, testing their morals, and exploiting their weaknesses. Matt was thinking about his options, considering every hint Jack had given him. He knew that the moment of truth would come suddenly and would change everything. As night fell over Genoa City, the stakes could not have been clearer. Jack had Matt, and Victor was running out of time. The delicate balance of loyalty, deception, and ambition that defined the city's elite was hanging by a thread. In a world where secrets were power and betrayal was a tool, Matt being in Jack's hands was the ultimate problem. It was the dangerous advantage and the most shocking revelation yet. As dawn approached, the players were getting ready for a battle that would have lasting consequences for everyone. The line between success and disaster had never been thinner. In that emotionally charged moment, the drama, pressure, and stakes of Genoa City reached a boiling point. Matt then would be flashed back not just as a shocking caption, but as the catalyst for a chain of events that would review every relationship, every alliance, and every battle for power in the young and the restless for times to come. The pressure in the room was nearly unsupportable, a pressure that sounded to crush the air itself, because Jack, pacing like a bloodsucker circling its prey, had Matt fully off balance, and every word he spoke carried the weight of manipulation, strategy, and subtle imminence, reminding Matt that in Jack's mind, nothing was left to chance, nothing accidental, nothing unplanned, and Matt, despite his fear, could feel the faint spark of resoluteness fluttering within him, a consummation. That indeed in the darkest, most necessary circumstances, there was still room for wit, for careful concession, for using what little heed to survive, because Jack, for all his cunning, reckoned on the predictable responses of others, on their despair, pride, and feelings, and that pattern of reliance was commodity Matt could exploit if he could just suppose easily under the suffocating weight of prison, and Jack, noticing the subtle shift in Matt's expression, smiled inwardly. Knowing that the game had formally begun, because internees were no way simply pawns, they were implicit pitfalls, implicit manipulators, and Jack understood better than anyone that undervaluing an opponent, indeed one in chains, could prove disastrous, an assignment he'd learned innumerous times in his long, complex life of contest, ambition, and survival. And as Jack continued his careful, nearly casual harangue about the impending deal with Victor, Matt heeded hardly, parsing every nuance, every implied hint, trying to erect together Jack's ultimate ideal, because he knew that if he could anticipate Jack's moves, he might find a crack in the else impenetrable wall of control that Jack had erected around him. And outside the room, Victor was formally marshalling, his mind contending with urgency, conniving how to respond without falling directly into Jack's trap, because he understood better than utmost that Jack's brilliance lay not only in his schemes but in the way he manipulated timing, feelings, and perception, and Victor, whose experience with commercial warfare, family treason, and dangerous alliances had tutored him to anticipate the unanticipated, could feel the adrenaline swell as he imagined the worst-case scripts: Matt harmed, influence lost, reports shattered, and yet, he also felt the familiar exhilaration of the challenge, that same strategic fire that had driven him through decades of insolvable accommodations, competitions, and rescues, knowing that he could end vacillation, not now, when Jack held Matt as both brand and guard, both trouble and influence, because in Genoa City, where fidelity was fragile, trust was scarce, and power was the ultimate currency, timing, intelligence, and courage were the only tools able of navigating the unfaithful waters Jack had created. And back in the shadowed confines of Jack's estate, The room sounded to shrink with each passing nanosecond, the silence between Jack's advised speeches stretching, thick with expectation, while Matt's mind oscillated between fear, defiance, and the forming consummation that survival would bear him to engage not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and strategically, because Jack's cerebral grip was redoubtable, and to break it, Matt would have to exploit Jack's need for control, his pride, and his hypotheticals about others, and as Jack eventually broke, allowing the weight of his words to settle like a heavy fog over the room, he observed Matt's response precisely, noting the subtle twitch of the brow, the pressure in the jaw, the slight narrowing of the eyes, each an indication to Matt's internal state, and in that moment, a small but significant study sparked in Matt's mind he'd to turn Jack's overconfidence against him, to produce mistrustfulness, vacillation, indeed a flicker of unpredictability, because in games of power and survival, unpredictability could be as murderous an armament as any physical force, and Matt, flashing back once competitions, former skirmishes with peril, and moments where cunning had triumphed over brute force, felt the first real threat of stopgap that he might survive, that he might escape, that he might turn the tables on Jack, because while Jack held the upper hand now, the balance of power could shift in a moment if Matt leveraged sapience, timing, and emotional manipulation precisely, and outside the estate, Victor was formerly in stir, reaching abettors, attorneys, and snitchers, while contemporaneously strategizing a particular intervention, knowing that the fewest misstep could lead to disaster, because Jack's schemes were no way just simple, they were intricate, layered, and multidimensional, with contingencies that anticipated every conceivable response, every spontaneous action, every emotional response, and Victor, seasoned in both commercial and particular battles, understood that any deliverance attempt would be a delicate operation, a chess match played under extreme pressure, with consequences reaching far beyond Matt alone, affecting reports, connections, and the very structure of influence in Genoa City, and back in Jack's lair, Matt, taking a deep breath, began to formulate a plan, a careful sequence of words, gestures, and advised responses that might sow just enough mistrustfulness in Jack's mind to produce an opening, because Jack, like all brilliant manipulators, was vulnerable to subtle dislocation, to precisely planted query, and Matt, recalling assignments learned from both musketeers and adversaries, honored that the smallest misdirection, the fewest misstep, could destabilize indeed the most confident schemer, and as Jack spoke again, revealing just enough of his intentions to tantalize and scarify, he made one critical misapprehension: he undervalued Matt's capability to read between the lines, to fate that Jack's careful language, his controlled address, and his measured pitfalls were all part of a predictable pattern, one that Matt could learn, anticipate, and exploit, because understanding your opponent's mind, especially one as redoubtable as Jack Abbott's, was an armament more important than any physical constraint, and as the twinkles stretched into tense hours, Matt still assessed his surroundings, noting the positioning of cabinet work, the cinches on doors, the subtle sounds of movement in adjoining apartments, the faint echoes of Jack's steps, all details that might latterly prove pivotal in turning prison into occasion, and Jack, for his part, remained confident, maybe too confident, completely believing that his cerebral dominance was absolute, and that Matt's fear would keep him biddable, amenable, and predictable, yet in that veritably confidence lay Jack's vulnerability, because the mortal mind, indeed under extreme constraint, frequently finds pathways to adaptability, to imagination, to survival, and Matt's mind, stoned by times of challenges, began to collude those pathways with perfection, knowing that one wrong word, one misestimated emotion, one lapse in attention, could jeopardize him irreversibly, yet the lowest correct move could cock the balance of power dramatically, and as the day outdoors turned into night, casting murk that imaged the query inside, Jack decided to escalate the cerebral pressure, moving near to Matt, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tale that suggested both trouble and secret knowledge, outlining the silhouettes of his secret deal with Victor in a way that was both tantalizing and intimidating, because Jack's brilliance was as important in the art of suspension and information control as in the manipulation of circumstance, and as he spoke, Matt felt an admixture of fear, determination, and the spark of audacity, realizing that indeed in the darkest moment, the mind could remain a tool of emancipation, an armament able of slicing through the bonds of physical prison, and as Jack eventually stepped back, satisfied With the pressure he directed, he allowed a rare moment of silence, a pause so loaded that it virtually bucketed with trouble, expectation, and the pledge of disclosure, and in that silence, Matt knew he'd the occasion to act, to test, to probe, to challenge Jack without driving the immediate murderous consequences he stressed, because Jack's need for control, for the satisfaction of dominating the situation, left openings for subtle manipulation, for cerebral maneuvering, and Matt, for the first time since being taken and turned, felt a small but significant swell of commission, an internal base in a situation that had sounded entirely hopeless, and as the hours continued, the pressure outside imaged the pressure outside. With Victor coordinating a multi-layered response, blending concession, trouble, and politic intervention, while Matt still prepared for the moment when words, timing, and observation would meet to produce a splinter of possibility for escape or influence, and Jack, ignorant of the internal chess unfolding within Matt, continued his intricate cotillion of dominance, concession, and imminence, confident that the situation was entirely under his control, and yet, in the quiet observation, in the careful listening, in the strategic tolerance of Matt, lay the seed of implicit dislocation, a memorial that no matter how brilliant a plan, the mortal element, the unpredictability of study, emotion, and perception, could alter issues in ways indeed a master manipulator couldn't prevision, and as the night strengthened, the storm of suspension, fear, and strategy boosted, because in Genoa City, the stakes were no way simply particular, they were emotional, commercial, and reputational, slinging outward with consequences that could reshape the power dynamics for times to come, and in this high-stakes game, every word, regard, and movement carried weight, because the presence of Matt in Jack's hands wasn't just an interned script, it was a fulcrum, a pivot point, a catalyst that could change alliances, reveal secrets, and enkindle conflicts that had lain dormant, and Matt, apprehensive of the insecurity of his position, continued to overlook, to hear, to plan, realizing that his survival depended on turning fear into strategic sapience, on exploiting Jack's overconfidence, on timing interventions impeccably, and on understanding the intricate psychology of the man who held him interned, because Jack's brilliance, while intimidating, was also predictable in patterns, in cerebral requirements, in pride-driven impulses, and fading those patterns, Matt knew, could be his key to not just survival but commission, to not just being a pawn but a player in a dangerous, high-stakes game, and as dawn approached formerly again, bringing faint light over the megacity, the pressure reached a nearly unsupportable peak, because the interplay of fear, strategy, and ambition was set to explode in a battle that would test every skill, every instinct, every ounce of courage, and in that charged atmosphere, where every study, every observation, every twinkle signified, the stage was set for a disclosure, a decision, a shift that would change the course of Genoa City, and OMG. Matt as then came further than a shocking caption, it came the center of drama, conspiracy, and a battle of choices that would reverberate far beyond the walls of Jack's estate and into the veritably core of the megacity's most important families and alliances, because in the world of the young and the restless, survival, power, and disclosure were no way simple, no way predictable, and no way without cost, and as Matt prepared, just beneath the face of fear, for the ultimate test of cunning and courage, the story that had begun with a shocking appearance had only just reached the threshold of chaos, suspension, and dramatic bouleversement, promising twists, reversals, and shocks that no bone. Not indeed the most seasoned players like Victor or the cunning architect Jack could completely anticipate, and in that tense, stimulating moment, the megacity itself sounded to hold its breath, awaiting the coming move in a dangerous, intricate, and emotionally explosive game of survival, power, and disclosure.